Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy Group, and our topic for today's webinar is residential solar and storage, weighing the benefits of bill savings versus backup power. And we have an excellent panel of guest speakers with us today, but before we pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. We're using a newly updated version of GoToWebinar, so if you have any feedback for us, please leave that in the post-webinar survey. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled. If you'd like to submit questions or comments, you can do so via the questions panel. We encourage you to submit your questions as the webinar is going on, and don't wait until the end to submit your questions. We'll be saving about 15 minutes at the end for speakers to answer your questions. Speaker bios are available in the materials section if you'd like to read more. Automated captions are available. And finally, the webinar is being recorded. We'll email you a webinar recording and slides within 48 hours. And you can also find them on Clean Energy Group's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, my colleague Seth Mullendor.
Thank you, Zareen, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As Zareen mentioned, this webinar today is being brought to you by Clean Energy Group. We are a nonprofit working across the country to enable affordable, reliable, clean energy for all. We work across a number of different areas to help communities realize their clean energy goals and ensure more equitable access to clean energy technologies. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is being specifically brought to you through our Resilient Power Project. The Resilient Power Project works in collaboration with community partners all across the country to build more resilient facilities within communities, specifically working with community serving institutions like community health centers, community centers, food banks, affordable housing, anything that provides critical services to low-income communities and otherwise historically marginalized communities through enabling locally led solar and energy storage development. All right, next slide, please. And we're really excited about today's webinar, which is very closely related to this work. This is through a new study and report released by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab called Bill Savings versus Backup Power. So I'll leave it to the speakers today to tell you more about that. And with that, we have a great lineup of speakers today. We are going to have a presentation by Galen Barbose with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab's Energy Markets and Public Policy Department. He'll be doing the presentation, and then for the question and answer today, we will be joined by Sunhee Baik and Cesca Miller. So please do enter your questions as we go along today, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Galen.
Great, thank you, Seth and Zareen. Thank you for hosting us, and thanks to all of you out there for joining today's webinar. We're really happy to be able to share this work with all of you. I am going to just load up my slides here. So Seth or Zareen, just let me know if you don't see this in full screen mode, but otherwise I'll assume you're seeing it. So the talk today is focused on a recent project that we released, that we published last month. And really the gist of this work is focused on residential solar plus storage and really focused on, I would say, maybe somewhat of a wonky issue, which is how customers can weigh kind of the relative benefits of bill savings versus backup power when they set the reserve setting on their battery. So most residential batteries come with this functionality that allows the customer or the installer to set some minimum state of charge that needs to be maintained on the battery. And this is really the lever, the toggle that customers can use to ensure that they have at least as much energy on the battery as they need for backup power purposes. But then, of course, the trade-off there is they have less battery capacity available to use for day-to-day bill savings. And so that's really kind of the trade-off that we're going to be focusing on. And really the gist of this analysis is to help customers, installers, other decision makers think about how to sort of weigh these competing value streams when they set up their system and operate their system. As Seth mentioned, I'm joined here by my colleagues Sunhee and Cesca. They're going to help with the Q&A, but I'll walk us through the slides here. I'll also just mention, you can see the QR code on the screen. That's where you can download the report. The report is essentially a big PowerPoint deck. And so the slides that I'll be presenting here today are essentially an excerpt from the full report. A lot of details. I'll be walking through it pretty quickly. So if you miss anything, just know that you can go to that full report and digest it at maybe a more reasonable pace. But with that, let's get started. So I think I kind of gave you all the basic context and motivation here. As I mentioned, we're really going to be kind of looking at how the bill savings and the backup power resilience value of residential solar plus storage systems is impacted by the reserve setting. And how did we do this? This is a modeling-based study. I'll describe in a bit more detail the particular modeling tools that we used. We focus here on single-family homes across a diverse set of different locations, which I'll identify shortly. We simulate power interruption events empirically. So in each of these locations, we've simulated how power interruption events occur based on kind of historically the patterns that we observe in each of those locations. These interruption events include both a mix of short and long duration power interruptions. For each of these locations, we need to simulate both power interruptions, but we also have to simulate how these batteries are operated on a day-to-day basis for bill savings purposes. To do that, we have developed kind of a standardized set of tariff structures. So we're not simulating the specific rate designs that exist in each of these locations, but rather we've developed kind of these kind of standardized or stylized tariff structures that allow us to compare more readily across these regions. We've got kind of a base case analysis and then some sensitivities. I'm not going to present all of the different sensitivity cases today, but I'll focus on, I think, kind of the more interesting or important of those sensitivities. There are a couple key caveats here. So the first and really an important one is that this whole analysis is really predicated on power interruptions occurring without any forewarning. So some power interruptions have come with some level of forewarning. Maybe there's a hurricane or a large storm, and customers can anticipate that their power might end up going out, and they can ensure that their batteries are charged up in advance. We're not thinking or focused on those kinds of events. Instead, we're focused on really the more typical scenario, which is a squirrel chews through your power line or whatever it is, but some sort of unpredictable power interruption event, and you're without power for maybe an hour or two, or part of the day. So important to keep that in mind. The other important caveat is that this is not a cost effectiveness evaluation. We're not comparing the costs of installing storage with the benefits. We are looking at two important benefit streams, namely bill savings and resilience value, and kind of showing how the trade-offs are made between those value streams in the form of the reserve setting. But we're certainly not looking comprehensively at all of the different factors that would go into a cost effectiveness evaluation. So with that, let me just walk through some of the key elements of the data and methods that we used. So these are the 10 different locations that we studied. Really the unit of analysis here is the county, but we refer to each county based on the major city that is located within it. So these are the 10 different cities or counties that we look at, which you can see span a diverse range of different climates. and geographies. The building loads in each of these locations are simulated. We used NREL's ResStock building simulation platform. And for each of these locations, we focus in our base case on kind of a typical median single family home within each of those cities. We also ran some sensitivity analyses where we look at relatively low usage or high usage customers in those cities as well. But the charts here just show the load shapes for those profiles in each of the 10 locations. We simulated PV generation using NREL's System Advisor model. PV systems were sized to meet 100% of the customer's annual energy consumption, and that results in system sizes as shown on the chart here. So generally, ranging from about 5 to 10 kilowatt PV systems, depending on the city. So the power interruption events we simulated using a tool called Presto, the Presto model, which we developed here at Berkeley Lab. Sunhee and our colleague JP were really the developers of that model. And basically the gist of this tool is that it can be used to stochastically simulate power interruption events at the county level. The tool was developed by taking historical hourly interruption data for each county in the US, focusing specifically on the years 2017 to 2021, using that data to basically develop kind of probabilities of power interruptions occurring in any given hour of the year for each individual county. And then those probabilities then are basically used to run essentially Monte Carlo type simulations. For this analysis, we simulated 1,500 years of operation within each of these 10 cities. The table here presents some of the basic interruption statistics based on those 1,500 simulated years. And so you can see, the average number of interruptions per year and average duration per interruption event. One important point to note here is that because this model was calibrated using historical data from the 2017 to 2021 period, the interruption profiles that the model generates are very much driven by whatever the interruptions happen to be during that 5-year span. And there are a couple locations that had very long power interruption events during that period. And so you can see in the table here for DFW, which is Dallas-Fort Worth, an average interruption event of more than a day, 34 hours. And that's really driven by Winter Storm Uri. And then in Los Angeles, a similarly long average interruption event driven by the public safety power shutoffs that occurred during that span. And so really, I think just important to keep in mind that the interruption events here are reflective of a specific historical period. They're not necessarily representative longer term historical trends, and certainly not of projected future interruption patterns. And so I would just suggest that when we look at the results here, to not be sort of overly concerned with the specific cities, but really just be thinking about this as kind of reflective of a diversity of different interruption profiles, and kind of understanding how the results may vary or not based on those differences. To simulate or estimate bill savings, we needed to stipulate some tariff structures. We considered two common tariff structures: net billing rates. So net billing, for those who aren't familiar with the term, is kind of the successor to net metering that has been adopted in a number of jurisdictions. And really the gist of net billing is that the credit for PV generation that's exported to the grid is below retail rates. So whatever solar that's generated that's used to directly offset load essentially gets the full retail rate, but anything surplus that gets exported to the grid gets credited at some lower rate. So that's one of the tariff structures. And the other is net metering, but with time of use rates, so with peak and off-peak pricing. Under both of these structures, storage generates bill savings by arbitraging between high and low prices. So under net billing tariff, arbitraging between import and export rates. Under time of use, arbitraging between peak and off-peak rates. So that's how the bill savings occur. The storage dispatch is also impacted by constraints related to grid charging and discharging. Our default assumption is that storage charges only from surplus solar and discharges only to meet net load. Under net billing, that pattern is basically driven by the incentive structure itself. Under the time of use rates, though, potentially those rules can be varied. And so what you can see in the table here is we kind of constructed a number of different variants with different assumptions about grid charging and grid discharging, whether it's allowed or not allowed. And so the terms listed in that table there are the terms that we'll use throughout the rest of the results. So you can see kind of 4 different TOU tariffs that each refer to different combinations of rules related to grid charging or grid discharging. The one that we'll be talking about the most is the TOU self-consumption case, which does not allow either grid charging or discharging. Just to give kind of a concrete sense of what the storage dispatch profile looks like under some of these tariff structures, here we've provided just some illustrative profiles for 2 representative days, or I'm sorry, for a representative day for 2 different tariff structures, the net billing structure and TOU self-consumption. And looking at the profiles on the top there, those correspond to kind of a low 5% storage reserve. So most of the battery capacity is available for arbitrage purposes. And under both of those rates, you can see that storage charges from excess solar during the morning hours, that's the shaded blue portion, and then discharges in the late afternoon and evening hours after solar drops off, as shown in orange. The difference, though, is really in the depth of discharge. And so under net billing, you can see that the storage discharges more completely all the way down to the minimum reserve level. And you can see that in the dashed line there, where that dashed line drops down to 5%. For the TOU self-consumption case, the storage discharges only partially because it's discharging only during the peak period and only to meet net load during that period. And so at least in this kind of a representative day, there's not enough net load during the peak for the storage to fully discharge. And so you can see it only drops down to about a 40% state of charge or 50% state of charge. And that distinction here is going to crop up repeatedly through the results that we look at. So let's get to those results. So we're going to start with just a single location, Memphis, which we chose for no special reason. And we'll just kind of walk through the base case results for this one location to kind of build some intuition. So first, this table here, this is a lot of information. Don't worry about absorbing this all. We just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of the key assumptions. And in particular, circled in red here, we've got some of the key base case assumptions. I want to just talk about 2 of those. The first is what we call the price arbitrage differential. So this is just the difference between the high price and the low price, whether we're talking TOU or net billing. And for our base case scenario, we're assuming just a 5-cent pricing differential. That's a very small differential. You can think about time of use rates around the country. Usually there's more than a 5-cent differential between peak and off-peak prices. But we wanted to start with a fairly small number here because we wanted to kind of tilt the field a little bit towards resilience value. And so we wanted to start with fairly modest pricing differential just to see whether the backup power value can compete, so to speak. But we'll look at some sensitivities where we alter that assumption. The other base case assumption I want to mention here is the value of lost load, which we assume in the base case to be $5 per kilowatt hour. That number, which Sunhee can certainly talk about further, is based on essentially a literature review. There's quite a bit of empirical research that's been done to estimate customer value of lost load, and $5 per kilowatt hour is kind of typical for kind of an average residential customer, but we also looked at some sensitivities there. So let's start by looking at the bill savings, and we show here how those bill savings along the y-axis decline as the battery reserve level is increased. And the reserve level, we denominate it on a percentage basis. That's just the percentage of the battery's kind of usable capacity. And so you can see, and not surprisingly, bill savings decline as you increase the reserve level because you're essentially reducing the amount of battery capacity that's available for daily bill management purposes. For a number of these tariff structures, it's essentially a linear decline. But you can see that for those two lines on the bottom, there's some curvature there. These are the cases where no grid discharge is allowed, and so the battery is discharging only to meet net load during the peak period. As we saw on the with that representative load profile a couple slides ago, under this kind of rate structure, you typically don't see complete discharge down to the reserve level, and so that's why essentially we see that kind of curvature. There's kind of idle capacity that doesn't get used, and so at least up until about a 40% reserve level, you don't see much impact on bill savings. Here we show how the reliability value varies with the reserve level, and these results were pretty surprising. We were expecting to see that reliability value would go up as you increase the reserve level, and it nominally does, but you can see that these lines are pretty darn flat. And this was a bit of a surprise to us, but as we dug into it, we were able to identify essentially three reasons for this surprisingly flat shape. The first is that power interruptions are in most of these locations relatively infrequent and relatively short. And so there's just not that much value on the table to be gained by increasing your reserve level. A second reason is that the initial state of the charge on the battery at the beginning of the interruption events often just happens to be relatively high, either because the battery isn't discharging very deeply to begin with, or simply because the interruption happens to occur at a time of day when the battery has already been charged back up. And so having a low reserve level is not particularly, or it ends up being sort of a moot point in those cases. And then thirdly, for many power interruption events, most of the load, most of the energy demand is being met by PV generation. And really the primary purpose of the battery is to just kind of balance solar generation and load over the course of the interruption event. But that initial state of charge on the battery isn't getting used much for the purpose of actually serving energy demands. So this next slide here just is basically a summation of the previous two charts showing how the total customer value, which is the sum of the bill savings and the reliability value, how it is impacted as reserve levels increase. It should not be a surprise that when you sum a downward sloping line with a flat line, you get another downward sloping line, and that's what we see here. And so really the bottom line, at least for this Memphis base case, is that customers are generally better off keeping their reserve level as low as they're allowed to do, at least in terms of maximizing their expected the expected value of that battery storage system. So that was Memphis. Now let's look at the other locations here. Rather than looking at all 5 different tariff structures, we're just going to kind of focus on these 2 bookend tariff structures, net billing and TOU self-consumption. So this is a bit of a spaghetti chart, but basically what it shows is again, that total annual customer value, so the sum of the bill savings value and the reliability value as you vary the reserve level. It's a lot to sort of wrap your eyeballs around, but I think you can kind of squint and just tell that basically you're looking at downward sloping lines in all of these cases. And so in effect, the story in all 10 locations is essentially the same as what we just saw for Memphis, which is that customers are generally going to be better off keeping their reserve levels low in order to maximize their bill savings, because the opportunity cost associated with foregone bill savings just it outweighs any reliability gains that they might receive by increasing their reserve level. Sorry, let me back up for a sec. So these results up to this point have really just been focused on kind of the average value across all simulation years, all 1,500 simulation years. But some years are going to be better or worse than others. And for a risk-averse customer, it might be helpful to know kind of what this comparison looks like under sort of an unusually bad year in terms of relatively frequent or relatively long duration power interruption events. To show that story, though, we need to kind of change the format of our results around a little bit. And so I'm going to introduce a new figure structure here, and I just want to make it as clear as possible what we're doing. So we were looking at these lines in the previous results slides that show how the total customer value declines with reserve level. We're just going to essentially convert those lines into some bar charts, and we're going to where the bars show the change in the total customer value when we increase the reserves from 20% to 80%. So we're just kind of picking a low reserve level, a high reserve level, and just showing what happens to the total customer value when you increase the reserves between those points. In this case, that value is negative because the total customer value goes down. So this allows somewhat more compact presentation. It also allows us to add in this little vertical error band here, which shows the range across all of those stochastic simulation years. So with that little innovation, we can look at the same results as we were showing before. So all 10 locations, looking at the change in total annual customer value when we increase the reserves from 20% to 80%. But rather than just looking at the change in kind of average value across all of the simulation years, we can also look at the range across the simulation years, which these vertical error bands show. And I think the bottom line here is it doesn't really change things. On average, customers are better off maintaining low reserves, and even in worse than average years in terms of interruption frequencies, customers are still generally better off maintaining low reserves. So we see some robustness in our basic findings across locations and across years. So let's quickly get to some sensitivity results here. As I mentioned in the main report, we look at a whole series of different sensitivities. I'm going to focus here on just a subset, looking at what happens if we increase the interruption frequency, which is we refer to as the acronym SAFE, and what happens if we change the value of lost load. We'll also look at then what happens if we layer on top of that some changes in the pricing differential. So the bar chart here is really kind of the same as what we were looking at a couple slides ago. So again, we're showing the change in the total customer value when we increase the reserves from 20% to 40%. We're looking here just at Memphis, and we're going to walk through some of the sensitivity cases. So this top bar here, this is the base case. These are the same results that we were looking at before, where we saw that increasing the reserve level reduces the total customer value. Now, what happens if we double the interruption frequency? Still negative. What happens if we double the value of lost load? Still negative. What happens if we both double the interruption frequency and also double the value of all lost load? Still negative. What happens if we 10x? Still negative. Only in the case where we 10x both the interruption frequency and the value of lost load do the results flip into the positive realm. So in other words, only under these, pretty extreme sensitivity cases where we've got 10 times the average interruption frequency and 10 times our base case value of lost load, do we see that the customer is better off maintaining high reserve levels. These results here were for the net billing tariff. Here we show what happens with these 10x assumptions under the other tariff structures. You can see under some of these tariff structures, we still are in the negative territory. In the others, we do flip into the positive territory, but it's less pronounced than in the net billing case. So this is from Memphis. And we show that only in this kind of extreme 10x scenario do the results really change. The next slide does the same thing, but across all 10 different locations. We're not showing all of the different sensitivities here, but we just show the base case, the kind of case where we 2x both of these assumptions, and then the case where we 10x both of these assumptions. And so you can see across all of these different locations, simply doubling the safety and the value of lost load doesn't flip the results. But in general, if you 10x both of those assumptions, you do flip the results, though the degree to which you flip them really varies pretty significantly across these different locations. Now, those results that we were just looking at, again, were based on this very modest 5-cent pricing differential. So we kind of really tilted things really heavily towards reliability value, where we're looking at pretty modest pricing differential and pretty extreme interruption frequencies and value of lost load. What happens if we now start, we keep those kind of aggressive interruption frequency and value of lost load assumptions, but we start ratcheting up that price arbitrage differential. So here we show the 5-cent case, which is our base case, and then each of the other colored bars show what happens when we kind of progressively ratchet up that pricing differential to 10 cents, 15 cents, all the way up to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. And you can see, as we would expect, the results start kind of moving less positive and into the negative territory in some locations. At a 20-cent pricing differential, that's enough to flip the results back into the negative territory for about half of our locations. For the other half of the locations, though, you can see even with this much higher pricing differential, the large interruption frequencies and large value of lost load assumptions still result in kind of the outcome where the customer's better off with high reserves. So it's very sensitive to the particular location in this case. So that pretty much wraps things up. Let me just kind of try to boil this down, because that's, it's a lot of information that I just walked through. I'm aware that I did it pretty quickly, but I think in the end, the story here is pretty straightforward. What we found, first of all, and somewhat surprisingly, is that the reliability value is pretty insensitive to the reserve level. And so that kind of core finding then really drives a lot of the results that follow. And so because of that, we found that pretty much across locations, across tariff structures, and across really most of the sensitivities that we explored, customers are best off keeping their reserves as low as they're allowed to do. And sometimes there are limits based on the manufacturer warranty, but as a general matter, customers are best off maintaining as low a reserves as they can. Now, there are a limited set of circumstances where raising the reserve level does increase the value, the total customer value. But it's a pretty limited set of circumstances. First of all, the customer needs to reside in a location with exceptionally poor reliability. In addition, the customer also has to have an exceptionally high value of lost load. In addition, the customer also needs to be on a net billing rate or on a time of use rate that allows grid discharging, but not grid charging. We didn't really get into that issue here, but essentially, if the customer is able to charge from the grid rather than only being able to charge from surplus solar, that also tends to really kind of obviate the need for setting high reserves, because the customer is able to usually quickly charge their battery back up. And so the battery doesn't end up sitting around at a low state of reserves, kind of regardless. And then lastly, just to add to that list of conditions, the price differential needs to be pretty modest. So you can see here that it's a pretty limiting set of conditions that all need to exist together for a customer to be better off maintaining high reserves. In general, low reserves are best. And so with that, I think I will stop talking and hand the mic back over to Seth for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Galen, for that really excellent presentation. They covered a lot of ground. We got a lot of questions. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. We had a few questions come in around value of lost load. Some noting that it's historically a hard thing to measure, and that some of the averages, you miss some of the specific use cases when you're talking about the averages. I think the one comment that summed it up kind of well is, what if a customer critical loads include home medical care devices that may be needed to prevent serious negative health effects or even death during a sufficient duration outage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm going to ask Sunhee to jump in a moment and provide a little bit more background on our value of lost load assumptions and kind of the literature there and some of the issues therein. But I will just acknowledge that last point you made about medical devices, and I mean that's one of the reasons why we wanted to include some high value of lost load sensitivities, is just to recognize that there is a wide diversity out there, and that there are cases where customers have really critical loads that maybe $50 per kilowatt hours is itself even too conservative. So yes, absolutely huge variation out there, and a lot of complicated issues. So kind of elaborate a little bit further on any of that.
Right. And I think your audio broke up a
Sunhee,
little
I don't know,
bit
you
there.
may be on mute.
Yeah, so I was
Galen.
not sure whether that was me, like my internet or his internet. But just to add a little bit of details in addition to Galen's description. So we've reviewed the value of lost load studies conducted for United States since 1990 to like last year. So and then those studies, we basically use the average value of those residential customers' value of lost load. But those studies reported the average direct cost, economic cost of the value of lost load. So definitely, as Galen described, like if those customers have critical medical appliances, or they have specific reason for having higher value of lost load, that could include because of their like household conditions, like having babies or in the home, definitely increases the value of lost load. And then if they work from home, like this becomes important after the COVID-19 era. But if those conditions kicks in, then the value of lost load definitely needs to be increased. So I wanted to say that like the $5 per kilowatt hour is based on the previous literature, and then the average only direct cost, and then that number needs to be definitely increased by those given conditions, or if the outage duration becomes longer.
Great, thank you. And that's a great point. We had an attendee raise as well, the work from home, which has been, there's been such a big increase recently, and those folks working from home, an important consideration. So I think I saw in the sensitivity analysis, a couple questions came in just about sensitivities around the ratio of the PV sizing to the battery sizing. I think you said you look at that in the report. Someone else also asked if you looked at a zero PV scenario where you just had the battery. If you could just give us a little bit of a look into what those sensitivities look like.
Yeah, no, I can. So we did not look at that zero PV sizing case. All of our cases assumed the same PV sizing. But I think, yeah, certainly looking at a case where a customer is relying solely on battery storage, that would be really interesting to do. We did run some sensitivities looking at different battery sizing. So for the base case, we assumed a pretty small battery, just 10 kilowatt hour size battery. And we chose that for the base case because we really wanted to kind of maximize the usage of the battery capacity. We also included a 30 kilowatt hour battery sensitivity. And it didn't really dramatically change the result. I mean, I would say it didn't change the results in any meaningful way at all, other than tilting them even further in the general direction of what we found with the 10 kilowatt hour battery. With a 30 kilowatt hour battery, particularly under tariff structures where there's not a lot of where customers aren't able to discharge to the grid. We did see, the batteries, quite a bit of battery capacity tends to just sort of sit idle in those cases. And so at least for those tariff structures, I guess this is maybe the one difference or sort of interesting point that we found is that if a customer has a large battery and they're on a tariff structure that doesn't allow grid discharging, that the battery, a lot of the capacity ends up sort of sitting around idle. And so there's not a big penalty for raising that reserve level. So I think, we looked at some slides earlier where we saw that, those kind of bill savings lines were curved, and the curvature, maybe started around, a 40% reserve level. As you increase the battery size, that kind of inflection point gets pushed further and further out, which just means that customers become more and more indifferent to the reserve level. So that was sort of a rambling answer, but I think the point that I just ended on was the key one, that larger battery means more indifferent to reserve level.
Interesting question came in saying, does the low reserve demand imply that an electric vehicle can be used for reserve with little threat to driving range? So for an electric vehicle battery being able to provide that reserve capacity, not impacting the ability to drive around as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, that's not an implication that we drew out. But I think as long as you're talking about, sort of a typical and relatively short duration power interruption event, we're not seeing a huge amount of battery state of charge drawn down. And so, yeah, that's right. Most, the batteries mostly being used for kind of balancing purposes.
Um, there was a question came in. So is there what type of value would be, or is this something that you explored of temporarily increasing the reserve levels ahead of poor weather or the potential for a public safety power shutoff event?
I'm sorry, Seth, can you say that again?
So yeah, it's basically is did you explore or can you make any conclusions as to what types of value there is if you know that there may be a power outage due to poor weather or a public safety power shutoff event?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. Okay. So, I mean, all of our analysis is sort of based on the assumption that the interruption isn't anticipated, that there's no forewarning and it can't really be reasonably foreseen. But yeah, if there is some forewarning, then that makes the reserve setting essentially kind of a moot point because you're just going to charge up your battery in advance of the event. Um, and so maybe another way of looking at that is that the greater your ability to anticipate outages, the lower you can maintain your reserves.
Um, Question about it. Do you think that this would scale to community solar? I guess in addition to that, I would actually add on to that, or for a community facility that had solar and storage.
Right, sort of for a resilience hub. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I hesitate in extrapolating there just because we're focused so specifically here on kind of residential single family homes. We weren't looking at the kinds of buildings and the kinds of operational schedules that would be more typical of kind of resilience hub application. I think the other important difference is that resilience hubs, they're often being used in the context of these long duration, often hurricane, sort of extreme weather related power interruption events. Um, and those are the kinds of events that typically come with some sort of advance warning. Um, and so I'm not sure how applicable this kind of analysis would even be for that context. But I think it's an interesting question to explore, and I think certainly we're interested in looking at how these issues shake out in other contexts and for other building types.
I think that this may go, well, you tell me if this went beyond what you looked at, but there was a question about what if a power outage hits at night versus the day time when you would have solar generation. How does that impact this? Did this study explore the timing of outages?
Yeah, I mean, so the Presto model, which we use to simulate interruption events, I mean, it's tuned to historical interruption patterns, and so um, certainly some of the events that come out of this simulation tool happen during evening, non-daylight hours, and the balance between daylight and non-daylight hours just really is driven by kind of historical patterns within any given location. Um, so certainly, I mean, we included those sorts of interruption events in the analysis. They're just sort of part of the overall distribution. Um, but on average, the results kind of are what they are based on, kind of the average across all of the different interruption events. I mean, I think maybe the most direct way, and I don't, unfortunately, have in this webinar deck the slides where we show the distribution in interruption events across different times of day. Within the report, we have that. I don't know if Sunhee or Cesca, you guys know or remember off the top of your head what those distributions look like. But that information is in the report. Um, I flipped back to this figure here where we show the distribution and results across the different power interruption, across the different simulation years. And this is maybe the most sort of the most closely related results slide to the question. So these error bands, the high end of these error bands, might correspond to years where the power interruption events tended to occur during nighttime hours, for example. So it's those sorts of variations are just really embedded within the overall distribution of the results that we present here.
Okay. Related question about modeling. It's just someone's wondering if the Presto model is available publicly or is it open source?
It is, yes. It's available publicly. I think I believe it's presto.lbl.gov. But in the report, yeah, good, thanks, Sunhee. So yeah, no, it's available publicly. There's a web interface that folks can use. There's also an API which you can use if you want to, run lots of locations all together. But yeah, that tool is out there. Sunhee and our colleague JP were the ones that developed that. So if folks have questions about that tool, please feel free to reach out. I think we're eager to get it sort of out there and getting it used.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you. Would you mind moving to the slide that looked at the price differentials, where the higher prices sensitivity analysis for the price differentials? I think there was some confusion around that. Someone was asking if you could please clarify with higher price differential leading to a lower value for the customer. If you could just kind of walk through that again, what this slide is showing.
Yeah. No, this is, it's a lot to sort of digest and hold in one's mind at one time here. But so what the chart is showing is not the total customer value, but rather the change in the total customer value when increasing the reserves from 20% to 80%. So a positive value on this chart here means that the total customer value is increasing when the reserves go up. So in other words, the reliability value kind of outweighs the bill savings value. Instead, a negative value means that the customer value is decreasing when you increase the reserves from 20% to 80%. And so, as we march to these higher pricing differentials, it's basically increasing the opportunity cost of maintaining higher reserves. And so that is, sort of by increasing that opportunity cost, we're essentially kind of sort of reducing the slope of that line, so that it goes from a steeply positive slope to a progressively shallower positive slope. And then, for these bar charts that are negative, in that case, the line has a negative slope to it. So hopefully that clears things up, but I confess that it's a little bit confusing.
That's helpful. Thank you for the explanation there again. And try to summarize a couple of comments that came in. Basically we've seen that the driving factor for residential batteries has really been around that resilience value, and these findings seem contrary to, I think, what a lot of people would have expected, that there's actually a lot of value in not having the high reserves. But then there's still that flip side of, well, if you have an outage and you've run down your battery, you're going to be pretty ticked off because that's why you bought it. I don't know what the question really is there, but I mean, I would just love your thoughts on the results and how that plays into what seems to be driving the residential market for batteries.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, and I mean, I think I would maybe say two things. First is that there's a lot of emotionality attached to backup power, and so it's here we're trying to put sort of a dollar value on it, but that's a hard thing to do, and it doesn't necessarily always gel with people's intuitions or their kind of emotional reactions. So yes, I mean, I think people do value resilience a lot. That is driving a lot of investment in storage. But I think when we actually look at the literature in terms of what people are willing to pay for resilience, at least in other settings, the numbers may not necessarily gel with kind of the emotional value that people attach. That being said, I also want to be clear that our results here don't really say anything about the relative size of resilience value compared to bill savings value. It very well may be the case that resilience value is still really important, but yet you should still maintain low reserves. And that's just because we go back to this flat line here. So it's not so much about the number on this y-axis as it is about the fact that the line is flat, right? So this might be a really, really high number here, or it might be a really, really low number. But that doesn't really impact the analysis that we're running here. Really what matters is the slope of the line. And it's the fact that the line is flat. That's really what's driving all of the results that we found. It's that the reliability value just isn't impacted that much by the reserve level. Whether it's a big number or a small number, it just is pretty insensitive to the reserve level. So I think that's maybe the key clarification just to make here. So hopefully that makes sense.
That does make a lot of sense, and I think that's a really great point, maybe a great point to end on. That what this is not saying is that there is no resilience, that the resilience value of a battery is not high. What it's saying is that the resilience value is fairly inflexible to the reserve setting that you set your battery at. Is that correct?
Right.
Kind of.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Well, I do think that's actually a great place to end the Q&A, considering we've only got a minute or two left. I want to thank you, Galen, for the presentation, and Sunhee and Cesca for joining us today and all your work on this study. It's really great. I do encourage folks to reach out. If we didn't get to your question, I know a lot of them came in right at the end that we couldn't get to. But thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters. And with that, I will turn it back over to Zareen for any closing comments.
Thanks again, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our excellent speakers. Just wanted to remind everyone you will be receiving a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar within 24 hours. Thanks. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.